Welcome back to Twisted Minds. Today we'll be taking a look into the case of Cassie Jo Stoddart. This was a highly publicized case from the early 2000s that saw an innocent young teenage girl lose her life. Cassie's perpetrators meticulously planned her execution and filmed the process of documenting their plan at school.
September 22nd, 2006. We're skipping last 4th hour. We're writing our plan right now. I'm telling Cassie's family, but she ain't number one. We have to stick with the plan. And she's perfect, so she's gonna die.
Yeah, things are about to get real disturbing real fast. Cassie Jo Stoddart was a vibrant young girl who attended Pocatello High School in Idaho. Cassie was just 16 years old at the time and had high hopes for her future after she graduated high school. She was incredibly close with her brother, who was about a year and a half younger than she was. She was somewhat of a role model for him, and he had grown to enjoy having a sister in the school as him, only a grade above him. He spoke with the Idaho State Journal about his sister and said, "Me and her were always into the same stuff and going to the same places. We did everything together, even though we would argue and stuff, just like any other sibling. I just miss having my sister right there, a grade above me. She was really smart, doing good, and had a lot going for her." Her brother Andrew said that Cassie was the artistic one in the family. She had a love for drawing and art and was very passionate about music. By all means, she was your typical teenage girl who was doing everything she could to live her best life and keep her friends and family close to her side. As is typical with cases like this, we really don't know too much about the killers or their upbringing. We know that Brian and Torey were close friends in high school. Many have likened them to the infamous Columbine killers, who took the lives of several students at their high school.
Columbine kind of created a subculture for kids who don't fit in anywhere. I saw at the time that they were in the spotlight, and that's what I wanted. I wanted to be in the spotlight.
By all means, these guys were best friends for life, and they would document every move they made before carrying out their attacks, exactly the same way as the Columbine killers did. These two were very well rehearsed before carrying out their crimes, proving that they truly had the worst intentions and were, through and through, just bad people. The good news for investigators is that these two compiled all the evidence needed to convict them without the police having to do much digging at all. They literally kept video evidence of the events leading up to their crimes, as well as stored all of the tools and weapons needed to carry out the crimes in a single location. The two were approximately 16 years old at the time of their crime. According to video evidence, they had every intention of carrying out more murders. Brian was quoted in the video as saying, "We're going for a high body count."
There should be no law against killing people. I know it's a wrong thing. Hell, you restrict somebody from it, they're gonna want it more.
Police caught them long before they had the chance to plan any other killings. So, with that said, let's dive into the events that transpired on that fateful evening in 2006. It was the night of September 22nd, 2006. Cassie Stoddart had been house-sitting for her aunt and uncle, Allison and Frank, at their home in Bannock County. The two were spending some time out of town and asked if Cassie would be available to help keep the home in order and feed their animals while they were gone. Cassie was more than happy to help out, and it seems like her aunt and uncle were willing to let her hang out at the house with a few of her friends to watch a movie. That evening, Cassie headed over to her aunt and uncle's home to get started with her daily chores. We don't know how long she stayed there, but at some time around 6 p.m., her boyfriend Matt showed up. She had also invited a few other high school friends, including Brian and Torey. After everyone arrived, Cassie was excited to show them around the home. She took them on a full-fledged tour and even showed them the basement. Little did she know that Brian and Torey were paying very close attention, not just to be good house guests, but because they planned on using this new information against her later on that evening. After the tour was over, they all sat down around the television to watch Kill Bill Volume 2. However, Brian and Torey got bored early into the movie and made an excuse to leave, telling Cassie and her boyfriend that they wanted to go to a theater in Pocatello to watch a movie instead. This left only Cassie and her boyfriend at home alone.
We found our victim, and sad as it may be, she's our friend. But you know what? We all have to make sacrifices. Our first victim is going to be Cassie Stoddart. She's going to be alone in a big, dark house out in the middle of nowhere. How perfect can you get? We know there's lots of doors. There's lots of places to hide. I unlocked the back doors, so it's all locked. Now we just gotta wait.
Cassie didn't know that, while giving her friends a tour, Brian had unlocked the basement door when she wasn't looking. This gave both Brian and Torey a way to re-enter the home later on without having to come through the front door. They went back to their car that had been parked down the road and put on full-body costumes. They wore dark clothes, gloves, and white masks to fully conceal their identities. I'm not sure how they managed to walk all the way back to the house without being seen, but they went back towards the unlocked basement door and quietly made their way inside. Once the two were inside, they hung out for a little while before deciding to try to scare Cassie and Matt. Once they realized that neither Cassie nor Matt had any plans of coming to the basement, they decided to locate the breaker box and began turning lights in the house on and off. At this point, Cassie got super freaked out, but Matt continued to reassure her that everything would be okay. Around this time, one of the dogs in the house began repeatedly checking the basement staircase, growling and barking. Matt came up with the idea to spend the night with Cassie to make sure she would be safe. He called his mother to ask if this would be okay, but his mother refused. She offered for Cassie to come stay the night at their home, but Cassie felt as though she needed to stay at her aunt and uncle's house with the dogs. After all, she'd been paid to do it, and she didn't want her aunt and uncle to feel as though she betrayed them. At some point during the evening, Brian and Torey began to restore power to a few of the circuits in the home. They said that their plan was to either get Matt or Cassie to come into the basement and check the breaker box. But as we mentioned a moment ago, this never happened. The two stayed in the basement until Matt's mother finally came to pick him up at around 10:30 that night. After he left, Cassie would remain in the home alone for the rest of the evening. Brian and Torey took this opportunity to continue taunting Cassie, doing their best to get her to come into the basement. They turned off all of the lights in the home once again, but Cassie was content to just stay in the home in the darkness rather than go downstairs to check the breaker. Finally, Brian and Torey decided that it was time to head upstairs. They quietly climbed the basement staircase, and once at the top, they opened and slammed the closet door a few times to scare Cassie even more. At this point, she'd been trying to sleep on the couch in the living room, but was obviously unable to do so out of sheer terror. Once the two were satisfied with what they had done, they sprung into action and attacked Cassie, stabbing her at least 30 times. A coroner said that just 12 of these wounds would have been fatal, but the two kept going anyway. Cassie would lose her life within seconds. The very next day, Torey met up with Matt and the two hung out for a little while. Matt was worried because he had tried to call Cassie several times, but she hadn't answered the phone. He would lose touch with her for the next 2 days, when police were finally called to her aunt and uncle's home after they had found her body lying in the living room. The police who first attended the scene said that her body was in a horrible state and that she'd been covered in wounds and left for dead. Before long, police worked their way down a list of possible suspects and found that Torey and Brian were the last people to have seen Cassie alive. An investigator was sent to the home of Torey on the same day that her body was discovered. The officer took a statement from Torey, with Torey explaining that he and Brian had left the home early into the evening because they got bored. He said that they had arrived at the house sometime around 8:30 because Cassie claimed there was going to be a party. However, when it became clear that the party wasn't going to happen, they left to go see a movie. It seems like Brian would go on to tell a very similar story to investigators. However, their lies would slowly unravel in record time. The interrogating officer asked Torey what movie he had seen that evening. He couldn't give the officer the title. When the officer asked him to describe some of the details of the movie, he couldn't even tell the officer what the movie had been about. This led investigators to believe that something fishy was going on with both Torey and Brian. Of course, they would be correct, and within just 3 days, they had begun to find all the evidence they needed to arrest these two and charge them for murder. Brian soon led police to an area where they had buried all of the instruments used to take Cassie's life. They had dug a hole in the Black Rock Canyon area. The most convincing evidence for investigators would be the notebook paper, and, more obviously, the videotape. The notebook paper had handwritten letters on it. It didn't take officers long at all to confirm that the handwriting matched Torey's. Torey admitted this, but still insisted that he had nothing to do with Cassie's death. However, as police began playing the videotape, they knew that Torey had just been caught in a lie. The tape showed video evidence of Brian and Torey talking about their plan to kill Cassie, and laughing about it. In this tape, Brian was heard saying, "We're going for a high death count. We're going to make history." Torey chimed in and said, "For all you FBI agents watching this, you weren't quick enough." Brian would add, "You weren't quick enough and you weren't smart enough. We're going to a potential victim's house, and we're going to snoop around over there and try to see if she's home alone or not. If she's home alone, splat, she's dead." They continued to record segments of video throughout the next couple of days.
Have you seen Torey? He's supposed to meet me here at 7:30, and it's 8:19. He's an hour late. You don't even care, dude. Okay.
In one clip, they denounced religion and the idea of God and Christ. They claim that religion is nothing more than a fairy tale that's used to scare children into obeying their parents and following the rules. They would later record footage of themselves in front of Cassie's aunt and uncle's home, and a few hours later, record themselves gloating after they had taken Cassie's life.
I just killed Cassie. We just left her house. This is not a f***ing joke.
I'm shaking.
I stabbed her in the throat, and I saw her lifeless body just disappear. Dude, I just killed Cassie. That felt like it wasn't even real. I mean, it went by so fast.
Shut the f*** up. We gotta get our act straight.
Okay.
This was every piece of evidence police could possibly need, bundled into one easy-to-view video recording. Remember how we spoke about the Columbine killers just a little while ago? It may not surprise you to learn that, in court, Brian Draper said that he was inspired to carry out his vicious crimes after learning about Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, the two teens who claimed the lives of so many students on that fateful day in 1999. Torey then spoke with prosecutors and admitted that he was inspired by the Scream movie franchise. By April of 2007, Brian was found guilty and given a sentence of life in prison without parole. But Torey's trial wouldn't be held until the end of May in 2007, and he was convicted on June 8th. Both were given mandatory life sentences, and they were both sent to spend the remainder of their lives at the Idaho State Correctional Institution. Over the years, both Brian and Torey have appealed the court's decision. I mean, come on. This seems completely pointless. There is obviously no chance that either of these two will ever be released from prison. After Brian's first attempt was denied, it seemed like he understood that he'd be locked away for life. However, Torey wasn't going down so easily. He has since filed at least 5 separate appeals alongside his attorney, doing his best to get his sentencing lessened. However, every appeal has since been denied. Still today, almost 15 years after the crime, he is waiting to hear from yet another appeal that was filed in late 2019. In the aftermath of Cassie's death, her family decided to file a lawsuit against the school district. Her family felt as though the school district staff should have been able to tell that both Brian and Torey were dangerous. The family felt as though their actions and the death of their loved one could have been avoided if the school had simply paid closer attention to these young killers. However, the case was completely dismissed, with a judge saying that there was no way the school district could have known that these two would become vicious criminals. Cassie's brother Andrew spoke about his life in the wake of his sister's death. He said that he was unable to return to school for several weeks, and when he did, things would never be the same. He said, "A friend brought me all my homework, but when I did go back to school, it was overwhelming. Everybody was like, 'How are you doing?' And honestly, I didn't know how I was doing. I was constantly pulled out of class, but I just wanted to be left alone. It affected us all in different ways. It took us years before we could even talk about it." Cassie has since been laid to rest, but her tragic death and the details of the horrendous crime that was carried out against her will continue to weigh heavily on the hearts and minds of all of those who live in Pocatello.